James Findlay was an evangelist and an early leader in American Methodism. In fact, he was the person who made the motion at General Conference in 1844 that divided the Methodist Episcopal Church from the Methodist Episcopal South. But it was in the early 1820s that he preached a sermon, as he often did, a fiery sermon. But on that night he had a man in the audience named Dan Michael, and it was a converting sermon for Dan Michael. In fact, it transformed him and changed the way he lived the rest of his life. 20 years later, Dan moved to Missouri, and he started a Methodist church in the Black Oak community. Never did quite become a town, but the community was there. Later on, he helped start the church in Cowgill when the town of Cowgill was starting, and even later in life helped start the church in Bramer. I have a picture in my home taken in 1903 of Dan, along with his son and his granddaughter and his great-grandson, on the day that his great-grandson was being baptized. I think that on that day, Dan prayed that his grandson would become a minister in the Methodist Church. Never did quite take. The grandson was a Sunday school superintendent most of his adult life. He taught a men's Bible study until he was in his 90s. He was a certified Methodist lay speaker. But the prayer continued to take root, and it grew, and I think it sprouted in me. So you might say my call to ministry is genetic, and it goes back a long time before I was even thought of. There were some other instances, I suppose, some little decisions that I made that caused me to go one direction, or a door that closed in one place and caused me to take a path that I had not expected. But no great significant moments, except for maybe when I was a youth, visiting a St. Louis youth group. I was from North Missouri and pretty naive and trusting, and so when they said we were going to have a worship service and everybody would be blindfolded, I willingly was one of the first to put the blindfold on, be led into the sanctuary, seated in a pew by myself, and then I waited. After a while, I thought, you know, my mother didn't raise any fools. Everybody here is waiting for me to be smart enough to take this blindfold off. But just as I started to remove it, the music began. Contemporary song in those days, which tells you my age, it was Simon and Garfunkel singing Bridge Over Troubled Waters. I'd heard the music several times, listening to it on the radio, and I had never really thought too much about it. But on that night, with the blindfold on, sitting in the pew in the sanctuary in St. Louis, Simon and Garfunkel sounded like the voice of God. And God was saying to me, when you're weary, when you're down and out, when you need a friend, I'll be your bridge over troubled waters. It was God's reassurance to me that God was present in my life. But it came with a twist, because it seemed as if God was saying, and I want you to be a bridge over troubled waters for others. At night, after the service was over, I was back to checking out the girls in St. Louis, as I had been doing before. No emotional kind of impact, and yet it stayed with me. And that's pretty much it. No cherubim or seraphim, no angels singing with the heavenly host, no strangers coming asking for a meal so they could give me a promise, no struggling with a man through the night, just a fiery sermon preached in the 1820s, and a prayer offered in 1903 intended for someone else, and Simon and Garfunkel singing a song they never intended to be a call to ministry. And yet somehow those morsels and a few other nudges along the way have sustained me through 40 years of ministry. And who knows, maybe in 25 years, I'll get to pray a prayer for one of my great-grandchildren that will take root in them and be the seed that sprouts in one of their grandchildren, and the tree of God's call to ministry will continue to bear fruit.